Let's go. Yeah. How you doing, buddy? Doing great. What's wrong with you, brother? You doing good? I didn't say I looked for you this morning. I didn't see you, so I was praying for you. Yeah, I didn't know you were doing it. I can tell. Yeah, I'll be here too next Saturday. So I'll see you on next Wednesday too. Okay. Christ, my blessed Redeemer, blessed be all my folly and sin. Satan makes all the world entreat me. There is no voice that answers within. Dead to the world, through voices that call me, living anew, obedient but free. Redeemer.
Heavenly Father, as we prepare our minds here to approach you, we recognize that this is a communication that you have asked us to participate in, a communication you take very seriously. We know that you desire a relationship with us. You've revealed your will to us. You've revealed your character to us. And this is how we can communicate with you the thoughts of our heart. We're thankful for that avenue of prayer. We're thankful that you desire that relationship with us. And it's an awesome thought to think that the creator of all that is hears us. Thank you for that. We praise you for your ability to do that. We praise you for the love that you have that causes you to want that to happen, to want to know what's on our hearts, to want to know what we have to ask you. At this time, we ask you to be with us this evening as we have already sung these two songs. We'll sing more. We'll open your word. We pray that you will be with us, that you will help guide our thoughts, and that we will maintain our focus on the things that are of greatest importance at this time. Right now, as we continue our worship, and even now as we raise our thoughts to you, we pray that we're doing the things that are pleasing to you. We pray that you will give us the wisdom to understand the things that you have told us we ought to consume our lives with, the ways that you wish to be worshipped. Pray that we will honor that. And we pray that as this group of people here is led through this worship service, this period of reflection and learning, we pray that we would be led with wisdom and with humility, and that we would, again, be seen as pleasing to you. For our goal, our aim in this life is to do nothing that is displeasing to you, but rather to bring glory to your name and to be a part of Christ's body in a way that we bring honor to him and thereby honor to you. In all the things that we do tonight and through our lives, we pray that you would help keep us from temptation, that you would, as you have promised, not put us into a situation that we cannot overcome, but you would always have the strength and the discipline to see the way of escape, that we would flee from it. We would recognize the crafty ways of Satan, recognize his presence around us and how best to avoid him and the snares that seem so enticing. Tonight, as we continue our service, if we fail, we pray that you would be merciful, you would forgive us. We pray that mercy would continue, and we thank you for that grace that you've given us all our days. In Jesus' name we pray. Let's sing Blessed Be the Tie. Colossians 3:14 says, and over all these virtues put on love, which binds everything together in perfect unity. Let's be the
Before the lesson, after the lesson, we'll sing "My Hope Is Built on Nothing Less," the Solid Rock. That'll be our invitation song. Before the lesson, let's sing "Give Me the Bible," which is 154 in the book in front of you. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, we're told about an exchange that they should do, the church of Colossae should do with the church in Laodicea. Letters that Paul had written to each church. You see there a strong desire that those early churches would have had for words that were inspired by God. Let's proclaim the same desire tonight. Let's stand and sing, "Give Me the Bible." We'll take the verses first. Give me the Bible, Son, thy deceiving, to cheer the wanderer, Lord, and tempest tossed. No storm can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, sends Jesus strength to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible when my heart is broken, when sin and grief have filled my soul with fear. Give me the precious words by Jesus spoken. Hold up faith's lamp to show my Savior near. Give me the Bible, all my steps enlighten. Teach me the danger of these realms below. That lamp of safety o'er the gloom shall brighten. That light alone the path of peace can show. Give me the Bible, lamp of life immortal. Hold up that splendor by the open grave. Show me the light from heaven's shining portal. Show me the glory gilding Jordan's way. Give me the Bible, holy message shining. Thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Be seated.
Well, this is different, right? Okay, so we could have done this in sermon format. We clearly could have done that. Let's freak it out a little. We could have done this in sermon format, but this was actually more work, so why not do it the harder way? What we've tried to say for tonight, as we've looked at the book of Colossians this month, is how can we end this on a strong note? So please take your Bibles over to Colossians chapter 3. Although this is not going to be in the format of a typical sermon, we look at the life of Jesus, and a lot of the time he spent with the disciples was in asking and answering questions, just kind of back and forth, and using that conversation to move deeper and deeper into topics. And so the plan originally was for Bill and I to kind of have that conversation back and forth, and then Bill let me know that he was going to be taking care of family this weekend. So Russ thankfully stepped in, and if the conversation between us here tonight is half as good as the preparatory conversation I had with Bill and the preparatory conversation I had with Russ, then I know we're all going to take away some great things from Colossians chapter 3 tonight. So let's think about where we've been. In chapter 1, we really said that Christ has rescued us. And we pointed out in chapter 2 that he's rescued us from all of these false concepts and these false philosophies that are out there, not just from our own sins. And then we push forward to say that if we're rescued, that we're setting our mind on things above. And in doing so, we're looking forward to this glory that is to be revealed at the Lord's return. So if you've been with us for each of the Sunday nights in the last 3 weeks, you've kind of gotten that path to follow. And what we want to do in our conversation is get really, really practical. So you start skimming skimming verse 5 through like chapter 4, verse 5, verse 6, just kind of that, the end of chapter 3 and into chapter 4, there's tons of practical applications to this mindset. So that's what we want to keep back and forth in the discussion. Anything to add to that?
Well, I regret Bill's not here.
Yes.
In part because just the effort and work that he had done in pulling all of these lessons together, even up to the point of working through this format with you. So they also didn't tell me that the stool was going to twist, and I was in danger. But that maybe they'll keep you on the edge of your seat all night and make sure that nothing happens up here. But I do think we're missing out in some of this stuff that Bill studied.
Yeah, it would be great. So where do you want to get started?
So I want to kick this off with this thought of, this would have been nice to actually ask both you and Bill this question. Put all the time and effort into planning this out. If you remember, this is the fourth time we've gone through a lesson on Sunday night related to Colossians. How has it changed you? How has it given you a different perspective in terms of resetting your mind, let's say, on the things that are above?
So, as we've been working on these lessons, there was some Photoshop work, but there was an awful lot more Bible study, right? And you just go through and you start to see these love for the people in this city that he hasn't been to, this church that he didn't plant, he didn't start. And as you get into chapter 3, I hope it comes across tonight just how much he sees each role and relationship within as being impacted by this mindset. It's not going to be business as usual in our marriage when our mind is set on things above. It's not going to be business as usual in our parenting when our mind is set on things above. And whatever kind of role you're in tonight, I really hope that comes across. That this mindset does have a really practical application. What about you? What have you taken away from the last month of hearing these sermons or reading through Colossians this week?
I think one thing that's come across is just how applicable this is really to us. I've always appreciated the idea that Paul writes this church, and in some ways it almost seems more personal in the things that he says to them than it does to the Ephesian church that we know he had this deep, deep relationship with them. But here it's almost as if he knows how important it is for them to grow, and so he's making extra effort even in a circumstance where he doesn't have the relationship to move them along and to be a part of their actual spiritual growth.
That's not unlike when we have any guest speaker come in. If they may not know us to the extent that our shepherds know us, but they left their family for the week, they've come, they've tried to invest in us being made obedient to Christ, which is not a point of the meeting, but I mean, it's a real mindset of what Paul is doing for this church, that he doesn't have that long-standing relationship, and he cares about their development.
Well, and it should say we should care about Christians in other places, which I think even this week as we're praying for Ben in Rwanda and Sandy's over in India and doing work, there are places where even those that are from here are associated with Christians we should care about.
And it was mentioned today in the deacons meeting that Stephen is with Ben. It's Ben and Caleb and Stephen is there too. All right, well, let's look at the text a little bit closer. When we see through the book of Colossians, there's a ton of different people that are mentioned. What do you think is significant about all of these people mentioned in this book?
What occurred to me in thinking that through is just the different types of people. So if I was not familiar with this book and I came across it, I would want to know whether or not it speaks to me. Does it have something to say that's relevant in my life in the way that I'm living today? I don't know how you come away from the book without feeling that there is a connection to you. He talks about so many different kinds of people and life circumstances. He mentions those in chapter 1 that once were alienated and hostile in mind. In other words, they didn't grow up as somebody following God or following Christ, but they came to know this later on in life. That's true of a lot of us here. On the other hand, it's clear there are others that did have a connection to God for a long period of time. But what strikes me, Philip, is this idea that it's really not about our differences. There's that in the section we're looking at tonight, chapter 3, in verse 11, trying to stress that it's not Greek or Jew or slave or free or even those that have been recently converted versus those that haven't. He kind of concludes it by just simply saying it's about Christ being in everyone. I think it's important for us to remember what unites us, what makes us all the same, even though the truth of the matter is we're very different. We've got different life circumstances, but the book itself will help you address it.
So all those differences when you notice that for one another, in verse 9, do not lie to one another. That there's this relationship going on that maybe you were in the habit of lying to Gentiles. Like, well, I tell the truth to Jews, but I mean these Gentiles, well, I can pull it over on them. Or, well, I always tell the truth to other free people, but my slaves, I don't have to. No, he's like changing this for them, no matter what their background is.
One other thing I think is interesting about the different people, the types of people in the first 3 chapters, when he gets to chapter 4, he begins to name specific people. And I always find that valuable because it's a reminder that the Bible is written to real people. I mean, they live just the same way that we do, have the same kind of cares and things in their days. I think about Tychicus and Aristarchus that we mentioned at the end. They were with Paul in Acts chapter 20 through all those adventures that kind of happened after that. Aristarchus is still in prison later on. We know they're from different places. One of them was from Asia, the other was from Europe, Macedonia, the city of Thessalonica. So there's some connections. But then in that letter he says, hey, Colossians, he mentions 3 people that are part of the church that he knows about. Doesn't know them all together well, but the church as a whole, but he knows Onesimus, he knows Epaphras, he knows another guy that I think you're going to talk about toward the end. Those names and all make the letter a little more real people.
Yeah, and each one of them having their mindset on things above. Some, you see that in their service, some you see that in their prayer life, but all of them have their mindset on things above. I like that.
So, Philip, obviously this section has a lot to do about the mind and heart of a believer. From the very beginning of it, where we're supposed to set our mind and all. It contrasts that between a believer and an unbeliever. So how would you say that a heart that's set on things that are above is different than the heart or the mind of someone who's not a believer in Christ?
So think about the terminology there for a minute. If you look at verse 2, right? Set your mind. And we said so much, set your mind, set your mind, set your mind, set your mind. And then verse 12 brings up the heart. And so when we met and talked through this, it's like, hey, why are we talking about the heart? Why aren't we talking more about the mind? There's this interesting thing that happens in verse 12 with this heart that is compassionate and kind and humble and gentle and patient, right? All these qualities of the heart. When I thought about, say, verse 5 to verse 12, it just made me think about looking at others differently. So many times we can look at other people and think, well, that's my competition. And I need to outdo them in some way, or I need to get ahead, or you can back up, like, you guys look at verse 8, verse 9, the end of verse 5, there's this greed, there's this dishonesty. If we don't have our mindset on things above, then when someone else has something that I really like, I would like to get one too. I can be thinking very greedily. Right? If I don't have my mindset on things above, then I may just go ahead and bend the truth and tell a lie to that person. But once I start seeing people the way Christ sees people, once my mind is set on things above, this person is not my competition. This is another soul. This is a person who try to help them get to heaven as well. I've been really struck in the way that it really helps us see people as souls that Jesus is seeking to rescue, that Jesus wants to glorify at his return. And so all these behaviors that might have been part of their past, I mean, he just rapid fires through them in verse 5 down to verse 9. Those behaviors have to go because I see this person and their eternal value.
You have to wonder if, like verse 15, let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. What was their life like before when they were unbelievers? Was there this turmoil of heart, the anxiety, the worries and things? Some of guys then reflect, or at least they could be now, saying you can let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. It'll just change your perspective on that.
Yes, it does. You know, we used that illustration in the sermon. If you were moving to Australia in 6 weeks, right? If you were going somewhere far away, if you were thinking towards that. What I think we see in this kind of first section here is that what if it was your job to get everyone to move to Australia, right? What if you had to convince everybody to start living their lives, moving towards this faraway where Christ is, where there's this new life and this new king and this new treasure, it would just change the way we interacted in all those relationships. All right, well, I want to ask about verse 15 to 17. So we get these rapid fire phrases: the peace of Christ, the word of Christ, the things that we do in the name of Christ. How does verse 15 to 17 kind of wrap up that new mind and that new heart?
Let's read it first. I'll throw a few thoughts into that. He says, we already talked about verse 15, letting the peace of Christ rule in your heart. Let's pick up in verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing songs and hymns, spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So I'll just let y'all know that this particular question, they'd already worked their way through it. I'm looking at it and I'm trying to think about the idea of why is it that those three verses in particular are important in finishing out the section? Where do you start the section, right? I mean, I think you could go all the way back up to verse 1 and think about the idea of here's a person who's been raised with Christ. That's a reference back to chapter 2 of them being baptized. It started over. Life has begun. What are some things that they need to be thinking about as they kind of come down to the end of this? And if you started with verse 12, though, that's another place. My version kind of starts a paragraph. Put on men as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. And here he's describing what a new man is like. So if I put on, been buried with Christ and been raised, what's supposed to be different about me? And he describes all of that difference. But what really struck me about these last verses here is it seems to me that from at least verse 12 on down, what Paul is doing is describing an individual Christian's relationship with other believers. Think about how we conduct ourselves in a community of believers, a body of other believers, the church, really is. And so how do we respond to one another here at Embry Hill? We're brothers and sisters in Christ, but this is one body here that we're kind of working together. And what's interesting is how many times through this section he's talking about the one another's. Bearing with one another in verse 13, forgiving one another, and so forth. The idea of living in perfect harmony in verse 14. But then he concludes it very clearly. These are activities we do together. Aren't they? Verse 16, the idea of teaching, admonishing one another. We've been doing that in our songs tonight and so forth. So the idea here, I think, is, yes, you are a new man. You are working through this. You don't do it by yourself. You need to be part of other Christians. You need to be engaged with them. You need to be working together in some kind of body. And whatever you do in that body, of course, comes back to verse 17, reflective of Christ.
Which is almost interesting because it seems to suggest that this mindset of things above starts in these relationships even before our family relationships. Like this spiritual family first. If we're not doing those things towards one another, then how are we even going to do them at home? And we might usually think, like, well, I'm going to do it at home, and then I'm going to treat other people like that. No, he's actually starting with the spiritual family.
And it's so applicable. I mean, look at verse 12 again. All of the traits of a new man are really ones that you would see in your relationship with other people. It's not just that I have pure thoughts. It's that I am compassionate heart. That means I'm caring about somebody else. My kindness, I'm showing them that. The meekness, the patience, all those are really reflective of relationship.
Yeah. It's verse 12 is not just something that you do isolated. It's something that every single one of those qualities is going to show up in how you deal with others. And I think with verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, right? Do all in the name of the Lord, giving thanks be to him, to God the Father. It might be really easy to say my prayer life has my mindset on things above. Or even my church family relationships has my mindset on things above. But he's ending this in verse 17 to say, no, in everything, completely across the board, this is the mindset you take every day.
Well, and so you mentioned the fact you get through this section before you start to talk about family and work and other things. But he now turns clearly in verse 18 to more of the aspects of our life, the daily life, and begins to make some application about that. So I got a question for you. So it's probably one that we both should weigh in on to some degree as we begin to think about what it says about a family circumstance here. How would you sum it up? What's the picture God's offering here of a family as we begin to?
Yeah, let's focus on 18 to 21 for a second. 18 to 21. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as is fitting to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children, so that they will not lose heart. As he narrows in how the mindset on things above going to show up in family relationship, it seems like all the dynamics in these 4 verses is loving cooperation. There's loving cooperation between husbands and wives. There's loving cooperation between parents and children. It's not just cooperation, right? It's actually loving cooperation that is being brought out. And we all know that there are obstacles to that. In verse 19, husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. I will tell them myself. Tracy and I went to visit my parents over the holidays a few years ago, and she stayed in the auditorium class. The kids were small, and I went back to one of the side studies. And I came out and she said, "How was class?" I said, "Oh, class was great. I just feel like I learned so much. It was really good." She said, "Oh, what was the subject?" I said, "Don't be bitter against your wife." And she was like, "Excuse me? Are you feeling bitter against your wife?" Yeah. Hey, so, and it was this great class. And you guys, I've said this from the pulpit multiple times. The solution to bitterness is gratitude, right? That is how you uproot bitterness. But I think here in Colossians, he's giving us more hints about how you actually uproot bitterness, especially in family relationships. If you have this mindset that is set on things above, then yes, gratitude pulls those roots out. But doesn't hope? They're hoping in the peace of Christ. If I expect all my peace to come from my kids obeying me perfectly, I'm going to be disappointed. If I expect all my peace to come from my spouse meeting my every desire, I'm going to be disappointed. It's the peace of Christ, right? It's the word of Christ. I think he's giving us more clues on how you uproot bitterness here, especially in a family dynamic. And so there is gratitude, and there's also this hope. But more than even just the hope, there's this mindset of Christ that we've been putting on. And then that, of course, would take us to Philippians and the humility and everything else there. But this book has shown us the mindset of Christ. And so the loving cooperation in this section is what stood out to me. What stands out to you?
I thought it was interesting in both the statement to the wives in verse 18 and into the children that he brings in the Lord. And, whatever the conduct is for the wife, it needs to be something that's fitting in the Lord. And then back to the children, the thought is that they would do what pleases the Lord. Now, you could note verse 19, husbands haven't told anything about the Lord. And I think this is one of those where the book of Ephesians is really a nice commentary on Colossians. If you're not familiar with that, they were written around the same time, they cover many of the same topics. In chapter 5 of Ephesians goes into a much longer description of the responsibility of husbands for their wives. Totally centered in the idea that you got to do this in the same manner that Christ did. So just that re-emphasis again, you've got to be thinking about the mind of Christ. What pleases the Lord? Those are the things as a child, as a wife, as a husband, really should be on your mind.
See, he didn't even tell me that yesterday when we practiced, right? That's great. The Lord is mentioned specifically in verse 18, specifically in verse 20, but in the Ephesians version, the Lord is all over the place for the husbands as well. So look at verse 21. There's lots of questions we think about as parents. How do I avoid frustrating or exasperating? The New American Standard says, how do we avoid setting our children on edge like this and causing them to lose heart? I think in this time that I was studying the book, the answer was just kind of jumped off the page. Come back to chapter 3, verse 5 again. Isn't it all of these sinful behaviors that he's listed in verse 5 down through verse 10? Those are what will cause our children to lose heart. If you want to know what will discourage your children, just lie to them, like he says not to do in verse 9. Or you go have an idol or impurity in your life that your kids can see while you hold them to a totally different standard. Yeah, that's going to frustrate our kids. I think what we maybe have overcomplicated verse 21 and searching for how do I avoid discouraging my children. I think verse 5 through 10 gives a lot of ways to avoid discouraging our children.
I would just add one thing to that. Oftentimes, as parents, we realize we haven't lived maybe as in accordance with this standard that's here. And we can be very hesitant about acknowledging that to our children who they see. They know when we haven't necessarily been the person that we needed to be. I think the willingness to acknowledge that, to ask their forgiveness, to recognize where we're going to try harder, we're going to do this, or that will have a huge impact on a child as opposed to trying to cover things, not let them know, present as if we are not capable of falling into that kind of sin. They need to know that we're vulnerable too, but we really do care about getting back on the right track.
Yeah, maybe not even letting, not stopping, just letting them know, but maybe actively thinking, hey guys, you're in your teenage years now. What do you see? Where can mom and dad do a little better? And having that kind of a perspective. Really good. All right, well, when do you think these qualities are most needed in the home? This cooperation, this love, this obedience. When do you think that's most needed?
It's hard to think of a time when it's not, right? I mean, I don't know how to say when it's more needed and not. I think we were talking yesterday. What really jumps out to me is sort of the negative side of this. You know, we're asking not to provoke your children. What translation are you using?
New American Standard.
New American Standard? Exasperate?
Exasperate.
I was feeling pretty good because I'm pretty sure I've never provoked my children. But they'll tell you I've exasperated them. But just being aware of the effect that we have. So I guess one of the times in which these are especially important are during those periods when you have great influence over your children. And sort of thinking through their personal development. You know, when they're young, your influence is you must do this. You're marshaling them along. But if you don't learn how to speak to them in a more mature manner over a period of time, you've lost an opportunity for that same kind of influence to take place. But I don't know that you could really say that there's ever a time that it's not. It's so important in showing those kinds of things.
It seems like the more stressful things get, the harder it may be to carry out these qualities, right? It can be stress because we have messed up and we're embarrassed about that, right? When we're embarrassed and we're maybe tempted to hide a sin rather than to come clean, that's especially challenging. And it seems like, just when things are tight, when you feel like you're out of energy, you're out of time, you're out of patience, that's a great time to wait. My mind is set on other things above. I'm going to respond to this because this is a soul. This is someone who Christ loves. I want to bring that heart of compassion and kindness and everything else in verse 12 back into that family setting. All right, well, let's look at the next one. Verse 22, basically down to verse 25. So, as we start looking at the relationship between, we can't skip this. I think we have to say this. Let me go back for a minute. When you look at chapter 4, you look at all of these different people that are named. You look back at this chapter about Jew and Gentile and slave and free, that huge variety that we discussed at the beginning. How many of us can admit that we don't have this ideal arrangement in our family all the time, right? And surely, with all the variety of people mentioned in the book of Colossians, somebody had to be sitting wherever they were sitting when the letter was first read to the church of Colossae, and they got to verse 18 to 21, and somebody's just like, Paul, dude, what you're describing is so far from the reality under my roof right now. How do I ever get there? What should we say to families that see that as an ideal, but know, I am not at that ideal place?
I think most of us feel that way at times. And this is something that is often asked of us as elders. Looking into the family, feeling like I see these other families around me, they're more successful in their spiritual growth, or I don't understand why we can't do whatever it is. You're painting that ideal picture. I think back to families that Kay and I looked to, and we thought, man, if only we could have the kind of devotions and the things that they're doing and be as organized in it. And what you do is you end up mostly reflecting on your own problems or flaws and not really focusing on what you can do to kind of help overcome it. I think the most important thing to do is there are no ideal families. Nobody's got this figured out completely. Even though you look around and you see how well they're doing and how well their children are doing, it does not mean that there aren't struggles and things behind the scenes. That's important for us to get it. But I do think this is like the uncompromising part. It should be true of every family, that every member in that family knows the priority. That there's no question that God and serving God is more important than anything else. There are a lot of important things. I mean, it would be important for kids to make good grades. It would be important for us to maybe participate in certain activities that are good health things. But if you ask anybody in your family, and their answer isn't clear, obvious, serving God ranks above everything else. We need to work. There's some way or another we have to demonstrate that. And I think that's part of the challenge of parents. Even as you get children involved in other things that they need to grow and progress in life, they cannot ever be in doubt as to what's the most important thing of all. So, the other thing about ideal families and all. So in the middle of this section in chapter 3, it's all about the new man. It's about, here's the old man, put off these things, here's the new man. I don't know that everybody in this world believes that it's possible to really be changed in a dramatic way. But I believe it because I think that's what God's Word says. It says, you can be this person who was, their minds were full of hostility and alienated from God. You could be a very wicked person. And yet there's this promise. You can become someone totally different. And if we believe that, truly believe that, and we approach our family life in that manner, that we can become somebody even better than what we've been before, we can work together as a unit to do something better, that kind of hope is essential to really put the effort and time into it.
And that's tremendous. And I think if we come back to verse 15 and 16 again, that transformation doesn't happen because we look at some other family across the church building and say, I'm going to be more like them. That transformation happens when we look back at Christ. We go, I want to be more like him. In fact, I want to first see how much he loved me even when I was nothing like him. How much he suffered for me when I was nothing like him. And then the things that we do to actually let the word of Christ richly dwell within you.
So you were about to move on to pass the family into sort of more of a work-type environment. Verse 22 actually is talking about the relationship of masters and slaves. So maybe one part of approaching this at the beginning is it reasonable, is it an appropriate use of Scripture to begin to apply some of these passages that talk about that relationship that doesn't exist today and apply it more to some of our employment circumstances, work, or teachers and students and so forth.
Yeah, if you've been in some of the classes we have in Colossians, usually when we get to this part, picking up around verse 22, that we're saying, okay, so how does this teach me to be, a good worker in just the business arena? But of course, the original context is people in that Roman Empire that were suffering in slavery. And we can acknowledge in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that Paul says, look, if you can get out of that, that's obviously better. There's nothing wrong with striving after having our freedom. I think it is important for us to note that although he begins addressing those in a position of being a slave, he specifically says, this is about your work. Verse 23, do your work heartily as the Lord, rather than for men. So when we start applying it to our own jobs and our own work life, we're not taking it out of context. We're seeing that this work that was at the center of what he was trying to address all along. And I think, obviously we can do sermon after sermon after sermon on Roman slavery versus American slavery. We want to be sensitive to all of those differences. That's not the focus tonight. The focus is to say, for us, with people with our mindset on things above, what does this say about our work. I had a teacher in college that said, oh, I see who you are. You always have that Puritan work ethic. I thought, what do you mean about that? You know, and it's like, yeah, that kind of old school American work ethic, like you're going to turn it in on time, maybe a little bit early, and you're going to dot your I's and cross your T's. I don't know if I always did that, but I at least did it better than some of my other classmates. There's a work ethic that's being described here that we should imitate.
Yeah, I think that the idea that you should obey those who are your earthly, everybody has an earthly master sometimes. And of course the difference is I can make some changes about whether I will continue to live in a certain city if I don't like the rules that are there, or I can change my job if I don't like the circumstance. But while I'm there are those who are over me. And I need to be respectful and following the principles that are in here. There's so many principles that are very applicable to us as we go through this. I think you were alluding to one as far as like how hard you work.
Yeah, did y'all see it was trending a few weeks ago about the quiet quitting movement in America, right? You don't actually quit your job, you just do the bare minimum. Not even to do your project, like the bare minimum to avoid getting fired. They're calling it quiet quitting. But that should never apply to Christians, right? We have our priorities. We set our minds on things above. But when we show up to come do a job, it's not just, well, my boss said, here's the quota. I have to crank out this number of widgets. And so I can be grumpy doing that. I can be uncooperative doing that as long as I hit my quota. For a Christian, the bar is higher in how we show up in the workplace. What do you see?
I think about Ecclesiastes, was it 9, 10, or whatever your hand finds to do it with your mind. So you could go way beyond some of the things that are mentioned here. I think it's important for students, for all of you. I mean, if you have a task to do, you may not make the highest grade, but there shouldn't be because you didn't make the greatest effort. I think that's part of what God expects of us, that whatever we're engaged in, if it's honorable and good, we will do the very best that we can in that circumstance. Because, I mean, the key phrase here, of course, is that you're doing it as for the Lord and not for men. And that's such an important thing if I am working in a job that I don't really like. Maybe I don't like the supervisor, I don't like what I'm being asked to do. I like the fact I'm supporting my family, or I'm able to eat, or whatever that is. But the point is, while I'm engaged in it, if I'm not working for that company, for that person exclusively, I'm doing it really for the Lord. There's some effect on others.
I had a friend back in Kentucky that worked in manufacturing. He had great health benefits, which was good for his family, had a good salary, and he called it his golden handcuffs. And he really did not enjoy the work itself, but he knew what it would provide for his family. He's like, I've got to get these kids through college before I change jobs. And so he's kind of needing his golden handcuffs. Yeah, there were days he didn't feel like it, but as unto the Lord, he got up and he did a good job. Look at the end of verse 22. With sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. It's this sincerity, it's this diligence, it's this respect. It just goes so far beyond doing the bare minimum. Yeah, I think that's true of students and of employees. All right, so I've got a question for you then. Let's move towards chapter 4, verse 1. If we talk about the heart and doing this unto the Lord for those that are kind of in the secondary position, he addresses masters in chapter 4, verse 1. Masters, grant your slaves justice and fairness, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. A lot of people here have leadership roles at work where they're either a supervisor over a team or they're even higher in their company. What do you think a Christian with their mind set on things above is going to do in that leadership role?
I think what occurs to me, first of all, is what am I going to look to give me a guide for how I would lead up, how I would supervise others. What's right here in the chapter, right? I mean, you go back again to verse 12, it's talking about relationships. And so even as a supervisor or leader, you should be one with a compassionate heart. You should be treating others with kindness and humility and meekness and patience. And oftentimes what happens is the examples for leadership around you don't fit that at all. But the standard's high. That's the way we have to conduct ourselves. And I think there's always a way to do that and still be effective, to do what the Lord has asked you to do, but regardless, it's absolutely essential. And then, of course, you mentioned chapter 4, verse 1. The idea is that masters, and so if we make the application here to those that will be leaders or supervisors or others, on our heart needs to be the idea of being just and fair. And the Ephesians 1, the parallel passage there, even kind of adds something else. Having finished the thought that if you're a worker, you need to do it with sincerity as unto the Lord and all, then it turns and it says, and masters, you need to do the same. Almost like, well, but how does that apply to, I'm supposed to be the one in charge, how does that apply to me? Because you have a master in heaven. And because that needs to be everybody's attitude. I am working heartily as unto the Lord, whether I'm a supervisor or work, it doesn't matter. The relationship and responsibility, I think.
Okay, so that wraps up the family section and the work section. We're going to end tonight in verse 2 down to verse 6, just what we're going to call the saints section. That every single saint, no matter what role you're in, these are commandments for people that have their mind set on things above. And so verse 2 down through verse 3 really dwell on prayer. When I think about that kind of prayer, I just wonder, are these the things that I've been dwelling on as they show up in my prayer life? Right? If Paul has been setting his mind on things above, then it is only natural that he would have some thanksgivings. It's only natural that he would be wanting God to open a door for the word. You know, it's only natural that he would be praying for these things. So it's almost like the mindset on things above, when we're not praying, is immediately leading to this desire for others to be saved, this desire for the gospel to continue to go forward. What do you think this mindset on things above does to our prayer life?
Well, I think about three places in the letter where there are prayers. And you go back and started with that in chapter 1, or verse 9. Since the day we heard about them being converted, people he didn't know, he hadn't met them, but he heard about their conversion, and he's excited. He says, we haven't ceased to pray for you, that you be filled with this knowledge. I want you to be growing. I have an immediate concern that the word that they've heard begin to transform them into new people. So he's thinking about those who are already there. And then as you point out here in chapter 4, maybe it's more about opening the word to somebody new, never heard this before. But give us, he says, this information. I'll know what to say. Come back to that thought. But I also think about the prayer. He mentions a prayer going on by one of them. Verse 12, Epaphras, who's one of you, a servant of Christ, who you always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. I think that's back to this idea we're a community of believers. We're working together. Here we are as a church. I should be affected by the spiritual failings of my brothers and sisters. You should be affected when you see me struggling with something. You should want there to be more maturity. You should want there to be more growth in the Lord, and that should be reflected in our prayers. But the fact that Epaphras is even struggling in it just simply says this was important. It mattered a great deal to him. And these are his home folks, right? And he's thinking of them back in Colossae with Paul. I really want them to be one.
Let me put you on the spot on this part. Look at the end of verse 3. God will open the door for us for the word that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I have also been in prison. Why do you think he drops in this note about being in prison in the middle of this prayer request?
So this is a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know the code that we sometimes talk about. A great question. If you've asked me something, I'm ready for that. A good question is, I don't really know the answer. I'm sure that was a good reason for asking that. I don't know why it comes up there. I was trying to remember if he had said earlier in the letter that he was a prisoner on Christ's behalf and all. I do think it's important to know the circumstances of where he is. And if you know some of even the way that Paul conducts himself in prison, he's oftentimes able to speak to others. Nothing seems to stop him despite that, but I don't really know why he mentions that.
Well, he You had mentioned in verse 10, Aristarchus being in prison. You think about the effort that Epaphras is putting into it. Just as you were talking, that was the phrase that was jumping out to me, to think that so many people would be centered only on themselves when they're in prison and only on their suffering. And if we don't have our minds on things above, we're going to be centered on ourselves. We're going to be centered on our woe is me attitude. And he just doesn't let that get to him.
Yeah, Paul and Silas singing
Right.
In the prison rather than dwelling on it.
So, and I think it probably speaks to his boldness. Like, hey, if I end up in prison, I end up in prison. But I just want to share the gospel with others. That stood out to me. Okay, well, we are absolutely out of time. So here's where I'm going to wrap up. Look at chapter 4, verse 17. Chapter 4, verse 17. And total shout out to Bill because this is his point. Take heed, or say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry with which you have received in the Lord, you may fulfill. Of all these different people that Paul is writing to and sending personal greetings to, the last person he's addressing, he's just telling them, finish what you started. Finish what you have been entrusted with. And so as we wrap up these 4 different nights of looking at Colossians and setting our minds on things above, your unique role, your unique talent, your unique ministry, Paul is saying, you give that your best. You pay attention to the difference that you can make in that sphere of influence, and you fulfill it to the Lord. So I just hope that we can end with that tonight. And we would say, of course, that if there's somebody that has not taken up that walk with the Lord, hasn't been rescued by his blood, you need the prayers or you need the support of the congregation, confessing your faith, and rendering obedience in baptism, and just let us know. We stand as we sing.
Nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest friend, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. And he shall come with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone. Faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand.
Be seated.
So good to be back with everybody here this evening. Thank you to Russ and Clark for lessons today. I appreciate that very much. We have a warm welcome to our guests this evening. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'd love to have you come back and be with us again. Our next meeting time will be this Wednesday at 7:30, and this Wednesday is a section special. It will be in the auditorium, and children will be reviewing the classes that they've had in the past. So please come back and be with us, and then we'll meet again next Sunday at 9 a.m. for Bible study and 10 a.m. for worship. So please come back and be with us. Just a few announcements before we are dismissed this evening. There will be a children's class right after services tonight around 11. And then a middle school, high school, young professional will follow after services tonight as well. And then the key was found with little owls and flowers on it, and a Kroger Plus card. So if you miss an event, can't get your card, see me after, be happy to give that to you. Also a reminder about the ladies' class materials in the back. The next segment of classes, I think lesson 1 and 2 is in the back right there. A couple of updates on her sick and prayer listings. Katie is experiencing kind of severe hip and back pain. She's not been able to be with us and has to do Sunday school. Please remember this, Katie. And then I had a note from Kina Rosetta that she broke her good foot on Thursday. Is not able to bear any weight on it at this time. She is scheduled to see her orthopedist tomorrow to determine if surgery is going to be able. So please remember Miss Katie and Kina in your prayers as well as the many others on the list.
Group 2 met earlier today. I believe Group 2 will be meeting tonight, so please remember that and join in for them. And in just a moment, I'm going to ask Ramon Phelps to lead us in a closing prayer. First, I'd like to ask everybody to be standing. If you were unable to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, you can prepare the baptism in the back, or the exit out to the other.
Big time one. Alright. This is big please.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your blessings. Bringing us this far in life, Lord, we pray that we can continue to follow the pattern that your Son set forth for us. We pray that we will remain uplifted and encouraged towards your kingdom. We thank you for being with us, and thank you for all the help that we have amongst this congregation. Lord, we pray that we will look towards each other for encouragement, empowerment, uplifting of the Spirit, Lord. We thank you. Please be with those who mentioned that are sick. We pray that we can do everything that we can to encourage them and help them in every way. Please lead us. Look over us. Forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
That's over here. The reason I have my mask on, I got a coughing fit. I've been having like a coughing fit. Yeah.
I know. What's the matter? You alright?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I found out. Yeah. Yeah. Them people got out the left, it's too bad, man. Yeah. 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 You see, yeah, a young man. Yeah, the screaming. You're screaming. Are you using your camera or are you screen recording? You got to use screen record. How can you do that? You must be recording something on the radio. Do you think they're using your camera or screen? Did you know you had the control panel open? Let me see your thing. Did you know that control panel was open all that time? Is that good?
They not can hear you.
Yeah.
Headphones on.